Tourism in New York City is obviously at an all-time low, but every step of the way, Cuomo does everything he can to kill tourism in New York. New York has the highest unemployment in the entire country. New York City alone has a 16% unemployment rate. In places like the Bronx, it's 25% unemployment. In places like Brooklyn, it's 21%. Queens, 20%. And instead of actually putting into place policies that would actually help with businesses, Cuomo, of course, is doing everything he can to kill businesses, especially when it comes to tourism, restaurant, and of course, many of these jobs are typically held by women, right? So most bar, restaurant jobs and areas in like hotel is typically in the service industry is typically held by women, and that's why women in New York have been devastated within the job market. For the most part, most of these jobs, yes, are considered non-essential, but it doesn't necessarily mean that in terms of what these jobs produce, namely tax revenue, is not essential, because a lot of these jobs help contribute, especially these small business jobs, help contribute overall to obviously the state of the economy. But a lot of those who are in need. It's one of the reasons why this proposal, of course, that he's put forth, it says Governor Cuomo announces new guidelines allowing out-of-state travelers. And you might be thinking, well, this is fantastic, because previously there was basically a restriction there. I think it was 41 or 42 different states that were basically on the restricted list because of requiring quarantine. So instead of having a 14-day quarantine, they've limited to, I think it's 4 days. It says travelers must get tested within 3 days prior to landing into New York. It says quarantine for at least 3 days upon arrival and get tested on day 4 of arrival. And you might be thinking, well, hey, at least they're doing something. If you did not take into consideration, of course, the basically average, when it comes to the average 40% of US tests come back typically too late to be, of course, clinically meaningful. And if you actually look at the data goes to show you that overwhelmingly, almost 74% of all tests that are currently done in the US take longer than 2 to 3 days. The average is between 2 and 5 days. And if you actually look at the chart, right? If you actually look at the chart, on the low end, obviously, right? On the low end, it's a minimum of 2 days, but you don't really see a lot of states that have a minimum of 2 days. Most of them are typically right in the middle, with around 3 days before they actually come back, which means that this proposal to allow people, of course, to move back and forth. So if you test, literally right on the first day of your quarantine, your next test will not be available, right? As it says there, and you must get tested on day 4, of course, to be exempt from basically traveling back and forth. Most people, of course, are not going to do this. One, because you basically takes 4 days out of your schedule. If you're traveling for business purposes, or if you're traveling, for example, for pleasure, if you're going by yourself, or if you're going with your entire family, you and your entire family need to quarantine for 4 days. Need to quarantine for 3 days, and then, of course, obviously, you're going to be quarantined. You're going to be getting tested. And the question is, and then, of course, on your 4th day, as it says here, it says on day 4 of their quarantine, the traveler must obtain another test, and if both tests come back negative, then you're allowed to exit. So basically, you leave your home, you get tested, you quarantine wherever you're at. If you're here for vacation or for business, you quarantine for 3 days. On the 4th day, you get a test. Then you got to wait for that test to come back. And like I said, the test can take, for most people, is taking longer than 2 to 3 days. And then, of course, you also have to take into consideration weekends, as COVID testing is a little bit lower when it comes to on weekends, because maybe no one is doing the tests over the weekend, or they're restricted primarily to those who are in the hospital setting and not doing those for individuals who are like asymptomatic. So these are other things that you have to take into consideration. And so you may spend anywhere between, like, I don't know, let's just say 5 10 days, which is almost the exact quarantine. You might as well just leave the minimum of 14 days. And then, of course, this doesn't take into consideration the numerous false positives that, of course, can come back. And then, of course, you'd have to quarantine again for more time. It's just like, it just seems like a huge waste of time, basically jumping through all of these different hoops just to enjoy the boarded up buildings and the boarded up businesses here in New York.
Businesses across New York City are boarding up in preparation for possible protest and violence on Election Day. The NYPD says it is prepared for any unrest. But as Eyewitness News reporter NJ Burkett shows us, business owners are taking precautions anyway.
It's just like either that or worrying about, am I going to get mugged because of the high crime that's been going on? Shootings have been going up. Robberies have been going up. There's been more protests here. So this does nothing to stimulate business. If anything, people will read this and they'll be like, I'm not looking to go through this. There was one couple who got tested. The whole family got tested, quarantine. They were trying to go to Hawaii. Their tests came back negative. Then when they landed in the airport said, we don't care that your test came back negative. They were like, you need to quarantine while you're here. And they had a timeshare out there in Hawaii. And they said, you know what? I'm just selling my timeshare. I ain't never coming back here because of the way that we were treated. And it just seems like people are literally doing everything that they can to kill tourism, especially in places like Hawaii, where most of their tax revenue comes from tourism. And it just seems like people are just not using their head instead of opening things up and getting their states back to business, because many of these, Hawaii is number 2. Hawaii has there's like 15.5% unemployment rate. You would think that they would be doing everything that they can to bring back tourism so that they have some tax revenue, because the people out there are starving. Puts people jumping through these hoops. And then again, it just seems like a huge waste of time. It just seems like a huge waste of time. And this, of course, is because in many other places where they're having high cases. But actually looking at this, for travelers who are in another state for more than 24 hours, this says travelers must obtain a test within 3 days of the departure from that state. The traveler must, upon arrival in New York, quarantine for 3 days. On day 4 of their quarantine, the traveler must obtain and seek another test. If both tests come back negative, the traveler may exit quarantine upon early receipt of the second negative diagnostic test. And like I said, the average is between 2 and 5 days, with certain people taking longer than 8 days. Some of my coworkers, they said that it took 7 days and these are nurses. It took 7 days for them to get back their negative test. As it says, 25% take 4 to 7 days. 36% takes between 2 and 3 days. And then there are some people that take up to 8 days, and then some people who are like, I haven't even received my test and they've still been waiting. So all this does is continue to hinder tourism within New York. And of course, it just means that this is going to keep on reducing the amount of income and revenue that is going to be coming in the state at a time period where the state is suffering so bad financially.